Okay, so here are some things, both in recent history and kind of distant history, you know, project cars I have found on YouTube that I really want to share with you guys, and the reasons are going to become obvious as I share them with you. Let's start with this VR38 powered R34 GTR featured on Motive Video. Can't go wrong with a Motive Video. The boys over in Australia, they build some cool stuff. My main highlight or takeaway with this car is that a VR38 without an X-pipe sounds very interesting. It sounds very different compared to how a normal R35 GTR does with that kind of almost trumpety, blary sound. But if you take away that X-pipe or Y-pipe or whatever it's called on an R35 and have it just exit out the fenders, I'm assuming R35s are like this too, it sounds very different. So that's just a neat thing to show you. Also, it's a VR38 R34 GTR. Obviously, I don't think many people would be doing that today, considering how expensive R34 GTR is now. But this was built back when R34 GTRs were like $35,000, $40,000. You know, cheap, relatively speaking. I know for a lot of people that probably isn't cheap. Speaking about unique sounding versions of engines and way to make engines sound neat, I recently learned what 180-degree headers are, specifically on things like cross-plane V8s, and how they can basically make a bog-standard cross-plane American V8 sound like a European exotic flat-plane engine out of like a Ferrari or something. I learned about this when I was doing research for candidates on M3 GTR power plants, like all the different options out there, which there are very few. Like, here's an example. So here is an LS7 swapped 997 Porsche, which is already very interesting, with 180-degree headers. Just to be clear about this, the LS7 is the engine used in the C6 Z06 and the Z28 Camaro. The LS7, an American muscle V8. And it sounds like this. Now, I'm just going to briefly talk about this, just because it's pretty relevant today, because it's 2023. Evan Shank's R34 GTT, I'm very curious to see what he's going to do with it. A lot of GTTs have already landed in the US, most of which are cars that have already been purchased and had been stored in Japan for a little while before finally coming here and being shipped to owners. I know a lot of people have already gotten their R34 GTTs. I don't know if he's gotten his yet, but I'm very excited to see what he's going to do with it. I'm sure it's going to be very clean and cool. Another thing I found that I think is really cool, that I think fixes all the problems I have with the McLaren 720S, is this Darwin Pro body-kitted 720 GTR built by Creative Bespoke. Something like this legit makes me want to buy something like a 720S. Because my whole issue with the 720S and cars like the McLaren Senna was that I don't like the front end of the 720S because it's modeled after a shark nose and I think it looks weird. But the front end of the Senna looks cool. So you could get the GTR Senna Darwin Pro front bumper for your 720S, and then do a cool body kit for the rest of the car, and put the Senna wing on your 720S, and kind of emulate the Senna rear end, but have also the 720 taillights, which I think look better. And I think you end up having like a really cool looking car, a 720 GTR, a 720 GT1, whatever you want to call it. I think it would look really, really cool. Something that I wanted to share with you guys is that Dude in Blue's 10-speed S550 Mustang GT. He took it to national speed, where they put the VMP Odin supercharger with a couple other supporting mods on there, tuned it, and basically gave it a little over 700 wheel horsepower or something like that, or around 700 wheel horsepower on street gas, on a stock motor, basically. And I think that is super, super cool. And obviously, because it's the 10-speed, when you romp on the car, you're always going to be in boost, so it's just going to pull like a freight train. So, yeah, the Coyote motor is really a cheat code engine. It's expensive to swap into stuff, but buying a car that the engine is already in, it's an American 2J, I'm telling you. I will say, another engine that's cool is the 5.8 liter Trinity engine. And, you know, this S197 Shelby GT500 featured on That Racing channel is also very cool. I'm a really big fan of this generation of the GT500. My only gripe with it is that it's got the live axle rear end. That's not really what I want in a modern car. I'd rather have the IRS of this S550, but I wish I could swap in the 5.8 liter Trinity V8 into an S550. I think that would be much cooler in my opinion. But looking at all this stuff, you know, all these cars that are being featured on these cool channels, I wonder if I'll ever have a car that ends up being featured on one of my favorite YouTube channels, whether it gets featured on, like, That Dude in Blues channel, That Racing channel, maybe the Smoking Tire or something like that. Maybe one day. It could be really interesting if that ever happens. Speaking of TRC, they have been building for several years now an R32 GTR. Back when they were first being brought into the country, they got theirs back when it was much, much cheaper. It's an RB30 stroker. It's got a PPG sequential transmission, Haltech, big horsepower, like I think it's over 1,300 wheels what they're going for. They want to run 8s or 9s or something like that because they want it to be faster than their all-wheel drive Acura RSX, which is super freaking fast. It's an amazing build. I don't know of many Skyline builds in the US like it, to be honest. Going back to Evan Shanks really quick here, we talked about his AMG GT3 replica street car. That was finished, turned out amazingly, it looks awesome. Builds like this are, you know, a man after my own heart is basically the phrase I would want to say for obvious reasons. I want to make my M3 and M3 GTR. I love cars that look like GT3 cars on the road. So, you know, this is super cool. And one last thing, because I know we've got a lot of OG Fast and Furious fans in the audience. Have you ever wanted to get yourself a Mitsubishi Eclipse GSX, but they're impossible to find? Well, if you don't care about authenticity and getting a genuine GSX, because that would probably be expensive and would take some patience, you could get an RS, a GS, or a GST, and you could Frankenstein it using drivetrain parts from an Evo, even swapping in the 4G63 as well. You could do this big Frankenstein swap of drivetrain and powertrain parts to make yourself an Evo GSX Eclipse.
You're swapping drivetrain components, you're swapping engines, I mean, transfer cases. Like, this is not a cold air intake install and like a downpipe. This is pretty high level stuff.